Hi everyone, it's Plastic EP here from Melbourne, Australia with Ivor Davis, and I've got to tell you, you're about to hear the most fascinating interview you will ever hear for 2020. It's the time that the Beatles met Elvis. Now I've done a lot of research on it and a lot of reading, and I do not know anybody apart from, let's say, the Elvis party that were there on the day, but Ivor Davis was actually there when the Beatles met Elvis. Please, Ivor, tell me all about it.
Well, let me start from the beginning. And the beginning is this, Plastic EP. In 1964, Brian Epstein met with Colonel Tom Parker. Brian Epstein, manager of the Beatles. Colonel Tom Parker, manager of Presley. And they met at the Beverly Hills Hotel, and they tried to put together a meeting with Elvis that year, 64. But they didn't, because the Beatles were too busy running around the country, and Elvis was too busy making 3 movies a year. Okay. So after the first year didn't work, the second year, 1965, when the Beatles came back to America, they finally made it happen. And here's what happened. I got a call late one day from Mal Evans, the road manager of the Beatles. And he said, "It's going to happen, Ivor. Get over here fast." And I raced over to their house, the rented house in Beverly Hills. And there was a limo. And we all jumped in the limo. And they said, "We're going to meet Elvis." Now, what I didn't know was, believe it or not, that Brian Epstein, the manager of the Beatles, believe it or not, said, no press, no photographs, no tape recorders. Wow, a historic meeting. Don't ask me why. Brian, who has a great passion for publicity, said no. However, when we got to the house, there were about 200 girls outside. So somebody tipped them off. We think it's Colonel Parker. So we arrived. The Beatles, by the time we got there, had taken a few puffs. I could smell it. And we got out. John walks up to the front door, knocks at the door like the postman. The door opens, and we all walk in. Well, there's a guy sitting on the couch, and he's got sideburns like shag carpeting. And guess who that is? Elvis. He's there in his own house. The house is outrageous. It's over-decorated, kind of Beverly Hills nouveau riche. But I mean, what the heck does Elvis know about home decoration? He brought in a designer, said, decorate the place, because this was a house that Elvis owned, because when he made movies in Hollywood, and he made a lot of movies in Hollywood, he made about 33 movies. He made 3 movies a year. So they wanted a place to live. So there we are. We walk in there. I kind of step back and try and be the fly on the wall. And the Beatles sit down. Elvis kind of nods at them. There's no greeting. There's nobody to say, Elvis, I'd like you to meet Paul, John, Ringo, and George. So they all sit down like Elvis is watching television with a remote, and he's watching it on this giant screen of at least 16 inches. I mean, back then a giant screen was 16 inches. And he's watching television. The Beatles sit down, and for 10 minutes, nobody says anything. It's embarrassing. Well, I couldn't do anything because I was not supposed to be there. So I'm standing around, and finally, after 10 minutes, Elvis jumps up, looks at the Beatles and said, "I'm going to bed." Good sense of humor. He said, "Unless you guys came here to jam." Well, that broke the ice. And so they brought out guitars. Poor old Ringo went in the other room to play snooker, pool, or whatever, your billiards. And the other 3 Beatles were given guitars. Elvis was given a guitar. They sat around, and I watched with amazement as they sang songs. They sang Elvis songs. They sang Chuck Berry songs. not one Beatles song. But that broke the ice. And so after they finished like 10 or 15 minutes, everybody was invited into the other room. I mean, there was a banquet of food, kind of pizzas and donuts and stuff, you know, finger food and drinks, whatever you wanted. And so everybody loosened up. We went back into the room. Elvis introduced the Beatles to this little girl. I mean, I say little girl. She could have been, looked about 15, but her hair was like about 5 foot high. Who do you think that was?
Priscilla.
Right. Right. I thought she was a teenager. I thought she was somebody's daughter. I mean, it was ridiculous. And of course, all around Elvis, there was his Memphis Mafia guys, you know, kind of, and they all fawned around Elvis, you know. I mean, I saw this happen when I went on location to Paramount Studios, had his Memphis Mafia doing his bidding. So we're back at the house, and the guys start talking about the dangers of flying, because Elvis said he was scared of flying. The Beatles said they weren't crazy about it, although that year and the year before, the Beatles used to travel around, as I traveled with them in '64, in a private chartered jet. So you had to fly. And I think Buddy Holly had died recently. And, you know, other rock stars had died traveling around the world. So I think Lynyrd Skynyrd, which was another group, I think they had a plane crash. Maybe they survived. I can't remember. So finally they started talking about that. And Elvis, and I think Paul said to Elvis, you know, Elvis, I wish you'd sing some of your old songs. I don't know what he meant by that, but Elvis didn't like that. He thought Paul was being critical of him. And so they chit-chatted about that, and the ice was broken. Elvis introduced the Beatles to Priscilla, and it was Priscilla. I mean, this looks like she should have been straight out of kindergarten. Well, I exaggerate. And so after about an hour of chit-chat and nothing going on, we all said goodbye, and off we went. And the Beatles said, you know, we'll meet again, don't know where, don't know when, but of course they never met again. What I would like to add to this is I didn't realize at the time the reason why Elvis was a little bit cool towards the Beatles was because, number one, he was a bit resentful because they had knocked him off the number one perch. He was king of the records, king of the hit parade, and then along come these upstarts from Liverpool. And also Elvis hated, believe me, he told me this and I knew it from other people, making these cookie cutter movies. That was the same story with a different leading lady, Mary Ann Mobley and Margaret, all these, same movie, but Colonel Parker had Elvis signed to a cast iron movie contract to make 3 movies a year. Can you believe that? 3 movies a year. So, and then along come the Beatles. They make 1 movie, A Hard Day's Night. It's a smash. So Elvis was not too delighted with the Beatles. Now, let me tell you, right, the day later, the day later, the meeting with Elvis, the Beatles then do an interview, and I was watching it with a guy called Larry Kane, who was a radio guy. And when Larry asked them, because none of the media except me came along, when he asked them what they thought of the Elvis meeting, they were lukewarm, very lukewarm. Believe me, it was, he was all right. Kind of didn't say it was a disappointment. They didn't say it was it was a washout, but they were very cool about Elvis. And then 10 years later, in the Beatles, they did a book called The Beatles. It was a book about looking back at the year, not the Beatles anatomy, but whatever it was. And anyway, and all of a sudden, 10 years later, they said, wow, it was historical, says Paul. It was a great visit. Oh, we got on like a house on fire. So with time passing by, the Beatles suddenly changed their tune. But I can tell you, it was very, very tight, very tough, a very not unfriendly, but certainly not as nice, diplomatic as it should have been. Go ahead. Well, you got a question.
It was very awkward. That's what it was. It was awkward.
It was so awkward. I mean, you would have thought that Colonel Parker or Brian or somebody would have said, Elvis, I'd like you to meet. Here's an introduction to the boys. Nobody did it. You know, they stood around like uninvited guests at a wedding. I mean, it was quite insane. Now, one other little wrinkle to this whole thing. You've got to realize sometime later, Elvis wanted to get into the good deeds of President Richard Nixon. And I know this because I saw the letter that Elvis wrote to Nixon, and it was a fawning letter when Nixon wanted to get reelected as president of America. He wrote a letter to him, said, I'd love to meet you. He said, I know, you know, I'm very influential upon the young voters of America, and I want to come and see you. And actually, Elvis did go to see him. Now, this is all recorded, and it's in the U.S. Museums, and you can definitely find this by doing historical research. So Elvis shows up in his white cloak, and what he does is he brings a present to Richard Nixon. And what he does, he walks into the White House with a gun. Can you believe that happening today? Nobody knows. Elvis pulls a gun out to Nixon and gives it to him as a present and says to him, I'm a great fan of yours, and I will go out and get your votes, blah, blah, blah. And then he says, the kicker, he says the Beatles are awful because they made millions of dollars in America, taking American dollars. They go back to England, they badmouth America about the country, and they've earned all this money. So in other words, for some reason, Elvis is bad-mouthing the Beatles for no reason at all. Of course, it's not true. They earned money, but they didn't bad-mouth America. And Ringo, years later, said to me, that so-and-so, when he said this to Nixon, you know, I've lost all respect for him. So the relationship started not well and finished even worse. And that was the story of the Beatles and Elvis. Now, why Elvis did make up these stories about the Beatles, I don't know. All I can think of is it was jealousy. And, you know, Elvis was just him and his mafia, and the Beatles were four together, stronger. So, you know, you can interpret it any way you want. But it was an amazing meeting, an amazing get together, but it could have been nicer.
This is what I need to understand. A lot of people say different things. For example, I've got Howard on the line. He goes, George and Paul denied that they ever jammed with Elvis.
Yeah,
you were there, so that's a myth.
It's you know, look, there's so much more. I mean, you're going to get so many different stories. I can't tell you. I mean, with all due respect to your caller, you know, they did play music. I saw it. Take my word, they did. I mean, it wasn't the greatest jam session on the face of the earth, but they did bring out guitars, and poor old Ringo got left out in the cold on this because nobody had drums. I don't know where this your friend, your caller, got this story, but believe me, I was in the room and they did jam. They did. I mean, they played music together, whatever you want to call it.
Anyway, getting back to what we're saying, Ivan, you are the only person I know. I've done a lot of research. There's nobody specifically has been in the room that I know in my whole life or read that can say today what happened being there in the event. I remember George saying, for example, it was like the Beatles cartoons. We're all in the car hanging out, and we all just jumped out of the car. We're going to meet Elvis. That was his description. Where the cartoon character's going, and there he is, and there's Elvis. You know, like, but what you said is true. They're going to meet their idol, the person that they idolized all their livelihood growing up as artists. Like, in other words, the Beatles were something new with Presley. They weren't the same. It was like an invasion. The Beatles invaded America, and Elvis is stuck there doing the movies. And I can appreciate it. And the Beatles are looking up their idol, they love him. But now the Beatles realise that they're up there with him. They're not looking down on him now, that they're with him. So that's why it could have even been more awkward, and it could have been handled better than what it was by not giving a proper introduction and breaking the ice.
Yeah.
And why would it have been so awkward when it could have been so relaxing?
I mean, yes, you're right. It could have been so relaxing if it had been handled in the right way. I mean, Colonel Parker and Brian Epstein, the Beatles manager, were quite friendly. I mean, they had lunch a few times at the Beverly Hills Hotel. And I want to tell you, I saw Brian Epstein's little letter that he wrote saying no press, no media. Now, why would you not want media? Of course, the problem would have been that they knew Elvis was very reclusive. They knew Elvis was not a media person. Elvis couldn't, look, I was a stranger in the room and I tried to vanish into the woodwork. The only people that Elvis felt comfortable with was his Memphis Mafia. And I can tell you, a year before I went to the film set of one of his movies, and they brought a truck at the Paramount Studios. So they bring out Elvis, and for 10 minutes, Elvis, yes sir, no sir. I mean, I'm his age, and he's sirring me. So I do a 10-minute interview with him at Paramount Studios about the movie, which is, I forget, maybe it was the Anne Margaret movie. Who remembers? And then after 10 minutes, in comes one of his sidekicks. Oh, El, he says, you're wanted on the film set. Elvis said, oh, thank you, sir, for coming to talk to me. I have to go and work. I said, can I come and watch? Oh, no, says the guy. Elvis doesn't like outsiders. He feels a bit self-conscious. So I said, Elvis, enjoy the film. So I get into my car, and as I'm leaving the Paramount Studios, I look to my right, and there's a big parking lot. And who is playing football in the parking lot? Guess. Elvis with the Memphis Mafia guys, throwing the ball so much. So that gives you some idea. Now, you tell me this. In all your research, have you seen great interviews with Elvis?
No.
Yeah. Yeah, he was just... So that was the way he was. And then he was protected in Memphis at the mansion. I've been there. I don't know if you've been there, but it's fascinating to see the way he lived. He lived in a very tight coterie of people. He didn't have outside people. But Elvis, as you know, was very generous to his coterie, his Memphis Mafia. I remember somebody told me that one day in a crazy mood, he bought like 8 Cadillacs, new Cadillacs, one for each of the Memphis Mafia. So he was very generous. The problem with Elvis was he was one person, and he wasn't that close to Parker. He was one person, who could think up crazy things if he wanted to. At least the Beatles could bounce things off each other. Say what a bastard so-and-so was, and so they had each other. Elvis just had himself, and that was the problem.
And that was the hardest thing, and the Beatles have said that themselves. Do you know to follow Elvis and be one person and do what he does? He goes, that's like not our bag. We're 4 doing it together, and at least we got each other. I totally understand that. That's a totally harder thing to do, to be by yourself.
Yeah, in Las Vegas, I remember I went to Vegas a few times. I never got an interview with Elvis there. I went to see his shows, and I discovered that he was signed to play the Las Vegas Hilton Hotel. The Las Vegas Hilton Hotel was very good to Colonel Parker and Elvis. They gave him a suite of offices. They forgave Colonel Parker's gambling debts. Okay, he was a heavy gambler, and I want to tell you that Elvis did at the Hilton Hotel over 500 performances. I mean, that's pretty slave labor. 500 performances at a hotel cabaret night. I mean, that's almost ridiculous, isn't it? So, but Elvis did what Parker set up for him. And Parker was the way he was. And Parker, of course, as most people know, and I think it's fairly true, was actually an illegal alien living in America. And that's why Colonel Parker never booked Elvis to play overseas, because if he went out with him, Parker would have been very embarrassed when he tried to get back in, and they would have said, "Excuse me, Mr. Parker." He wasn't really a colonel. "Excuse me, Mr. Parker, but you don't have the right visas." So rather than do that, he protected Elvis so much so that he never gave Elvis an overseas gig. Amazing. Anyway, so that was the whole Elvis story. And I know you know a lot about Elvis. And the other thing I want to tell you is that John Lennon told me before he went to see Elvis that he was looking forward with great excitement because he grew up with Blue Suede Shoes and Heartbreak Hotel, listening to Elvis on a pirate radio, Radio Luxembourg. When in England, you didn't have rock and roll stations, so you had to listen to Europe. So they were primed to meet Elvis and have a great time. When they got there, it was a bit of a wet balloon.
Is it true that John Lennon took Elvis aside and said, "I love your music, but get back to what you were doing. Why are you recording rubbish?"
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't think he actually said, "Why are you recording rubbish?" I think even John, who was pretty brutal, could be brutal and was provocative and loved to provoke people. I mean, I think the conversation, I mean, I didn't record it, but I kind of overheard it. I think he said, get back to recording the kind of stuff that you were doing before. Elvis took offense to that. Elvis kind of felt, how come these young punks were telling me what to record? And he didn't take the criticism or the question too kindly. But, who would, given the jealousy, the rivalry, the whatever? I mean, there was room for all of them, but that was the nature of the beast, and it just wasn't the greatest meeting on the face of the earth.
And see, that had a lot to do with it. And also, let me say, we can say whatever we like, and you were there, and that's all I need to know, because this is the kind of interview you're going to listen in 10, 20 years' time. No one tells it as it is unless they were there. Mal's not here to tell it. The Colonel's not here to tell it. Brian's not here to tell it. Right. Who's here to tell it? And the ones that were there, they're not saying anything about it. They're not going in depth as you are. So I've got to say, looking back at what it is now, how privileged you were to get a call from Mal, to be there and actually see it, because I don't know anybody else who's come out and has spoken about it. And that's why this interview is riveting, because you're saying it as you see it. So it doesn't matter what anyone else says in the world. Unless they were there, they can't talk.
All right, let me ask you a question. You've obviously done a lot of research on this. What have you seen that you can recall that the Memphis Mafia guys that were there has said about that meeting? Have they said it was fantastic, wonderful, it was a great hit? Do you remember?
No, I'd just say, in all due respect to everything, all right, there's two sides to the table. We love Elvis. The way he ran his life and with the Memphis Mafia, that's his prerogative. The guy needed to push people away because he was Elvis. I can appreciate that. And everybody comes out with different stories of what it is. So we've got the situation where we know how cold this meeting was, or wasn't that friendly, or they jammed and they were cordial to each other because they waited to meet each other. And it was the meeting of the egos, the way I see it now. So in other words, you and me are like, I don't know you. You don't know me. But I've been looking at you. You're my idol. Now I come in the limelight, in your limelight, and you're in my limelight too. So now we've got two giants meeting. What is my perception then of you? If we don't start off at a good start, I'm thinking, he's not what I think he is, or I don't think that. So there's a lot of thoughts going through their mind, because these guys now are at the top of their game, top of the world, and the Beatles have invaded the US. So how do you think Elvis felt? And I can understand too, because you got to remember, this is one guy, not four. So what's going through his head? When he's dealing with them, he's not dealing with one guy. He's dealing with four egos.
Yeah.
True or not?
Yeah, well, I mean, yeah, I mean, it's a bit like, I mean, this is probably not a good comparison, but it's a bit like, you know, if you were a member of the mafia and I was a member of the mafia and I suddenly invaded your turf, you would not be a happy camper. So, I mean, that's not really the way it is, but you know what I mean? And I think exactly, you know, the jealousy, resentment thing is there. And the fact that years later, as I said, Elvis goes to see Nixon and tries to impress him by bad mouthing the Beatles is pretty it's dastardly. It's pretty awful, isn't it?
Yes, but again, you can understand underneath. Maybe Elvis loved the Beatles, but he can't come out and say, "I love you guys," even though Ed Sullivan got the telegram from Colonel Parker wishing everybody the best.
Yeah.
That's when they first started out. But now Elvis is watching these guys with longevity. They're not here for 1 week. We've invaded America. The Beatles have got longevity. So these guys are doing it week in, day out, day in, and Elvis is going, what's going on? They still like the Beatles? Every day wakes up, they still like the Beatles? How would you feel?
Yeah, well, I mean, you know, I mean, basically, what did Elvis have? He had a big ego. I think you have to have a big ego to do what you do. And then all of a sudden, the Beatles have chipped away at that ego. I mean, if you know, in not in an upfront way, but he's seen it. He looks at the charts and he sees he's not top, you know. And so and he doesn't have anybody to talk to. He doesn't have anybody to bounce it off. Priscilla certainly not. She's too young. I mean, she's like still a child. And the Memphis Mafia are yes men, aren't they? So they're not going to give him any advice. And Parker is Parker. He does his own thing. You know, it's a no contest, 4 against 1.
Well, Parker had the control, and in all fairness, the Memphis Mafia were all with Elvis, which is a good thing. So when you look at it that way, the way I see it is Elvis with his group, and there's Colonel Parker telling them what to do, even though sometimes he told them, go do the ridiculous, and whether Elvis liked it or not, he did it, right? So you've got that going on too. But, you know, as I see it in history, the Memphis Mafia were there for Elvis. More for Elvis than the Colonel.
Oh, yeah.
So you've got two factions there. That Memphis Mafia would do anything for Elvis. They loved him. And they grew up with him through high school, through whatever. So we got to be all fair. If I'm meeting you and you've got your camp of people and I come in and I'm a 4-headed monster, you guys are going to check me out. You're not going to think, oh, we can't let these guys think that we think they're better than us. So that's normal.
Yeah, well, I mean, look, you know the Memphis Mafia, there's quite a few of them. I think it was Joe Esposito was kind of the leader of the pack, wasn't he? And he was the one that kind of was a sort of the lieutenant or the lieutenant of the Memphis Mafia. But the other guys were just ordinary guys, you know, who did what Elvis said and what Joe said. So, and they weren't men of a learned opinion. They weren't somebody like Parker who was running Elvis, who was his runner, if you like. And so it was, as I said a few minutes ago, and you agree, I think, that it was no contest, you know, 4 against 1, and he's outnumbered.
That's right. That's my thinking anyway. But as I said, history now is, as I said, it's just a page. But for you, Ivor, to be there, and as soon as I found it, you told me, you know, I was at the meeting with Elvis and the Beatles. I have not slept. This is true. Have not slept since the time we had our last interview, thinking about how it must have been to have actually been there. And for me now to speak to someone who was in that room. Anyone can say anything they like outside of what you and me discuss, but you were there. And that, to me, whether you knew you were making history or not, you did.
Look, you know that there will be and there continues to be armchair pundits who are going to say, well, you know, it must have gone like this because it must have gone like that. But, you know, I was in the room and I was there and I did see what I saw. And I saw the discomfort for the reasons you said. I mean, the meeting was set up by the two bosses, Parker and Epstein. And then it was up to the Beatles, and the Beatles were in awe of Elvis, there's no doubt. But Elvis was human and flawed and a non-social person. He's not the kind of guy, and I think you would agree, who's, I mean, he was generous, but he was not a social animal. It was something in his makeup. The Beatles, I mean, John was the way he was. Paul was a real mixer. George and Ringo were kind of a little less up front at the time, young guys. And so the fact that there was not a go-between, if they'd had a go-between, if they'd had you or me to say, Elvis, we loved the last two movies, and what do you think of I mean, somebody who broke the ice, somebody who was the kind of negotiator, the mediator, it would have worked much better. But nobody stepped forward.
You know what? That's the crux of the matter there. There is the problem there before what happened. Had someone come in and said, here, Paul, and Ringo, meet Elvis. Yeah. Straight away, they got off to a start. 10 minutes of not talking to each other. Yeah. That's like a standoff. And wondering who's going to open their mouth first. That made it awkward from the start. Yeah. So all those factors may have made it more awkward than what it was. And that's why it should never have been like that. But you know what? It was like that. Yeah. So whatever we say, only you know what you saw. And I don't question that one bit. I don't question it one bit what you've told us today. And anybody out there wants to go and think different or do whatever, that's fine.
Yeah, you are going to get people. I mean, people are going to call you up and say, hey, they never did meet, or when they met, they sang and danced, and it was a wonderful a reunion. I mean, it wasn't. It was not. It was an awkward time for all of them. So I can just tell you what I saw as a fly on the wall. And you know, and they said to me, keep your mouth shut, Ivor, because, you know, because when I got there, people looked at me and thought, who is that guy? He's not one of the Beatles, obviously. No, of course not.
You were the odd man out.
So I had to kind of vanish in the woodwork, like be the invisible man, as I say. But
yeah, but they could have said he carries the baggage from the cars. Get our luggage.
I was a bag man.
Yeah. Listen, I love you. You know what? We summed it all up in 32 minutes. You can't say more than what you did. I can't wait for our next interview. This one was riveting to me. This is the interview of 2020 and beyond. This is historical. Make no mistake about this interview. And I thank you so much for putting it all on the table and saying it as it was. Because so many people, as I said, they may have been there, but they don't talk about it. And some people can come out and maybe make it icing on the cake and it's rosy and this and that. It's fine. I can only speak to somebody like on this program that was there. And there's no one else. Is there anybody else out there prepared to say they're at the meeting and come on my show and tell me what happened? Please do, because I give you that invitation.
Thank you.
Enough said. Plastic EP and Ivor Davis, we love you. You're the man. Can't wait for the next episode. Thanks again, Ivor. Stay there.
Thank you.
Stay there.